Welcome to Jurassic Park. This is Gardens by the Bay. It's a celebration of nature, with towering super trees and over 1 million plants sourced from almost every continent. It is without a doubt an engineering marvel that exemplifies Singapore's stretch for sustainability while cementing itself as a global leader in environmental innovation. From a garden city to a city in nature.
But this place is no stranger to critiques that undermine its natural effects as nothing more than special effects. The land we are standing on is all reclaimed. The plants are curated and placed within carefully controlled environments. To some, the gardens hardly represents environmentalism, with its artificial structures and engineered ecosystems. It's a museum, not a forest, and these super trees are nothing more than spectacle, or at best, exhibits.
So, rather than asking whether this is real nature or not, I want to examine exactly what kind of environmentalism is produced by the gardens. What does this reveal about how global environmental ideas are reshaped within capitalist and cosmopolitan lens, using Singapore and Gardens by the Bay as a case study?
Okay, before that, we must clarify what we mean by environmentalism exactly. Environmentalism is about protecting, managing, and rehabilitating ecosystems while framing how societies relate to nature. In Singapore, while we certainly have nature reserves that emphasize protection, there is this big narrative, which is not unique to Singapore, of urbanization within constrained spatial resources, necessitating the organization and engineering of our natural resources in the context of human habitation. But does this dilute environmentalism? Let's add another dimension to this discussion by turning to global flows. We must first realize that environmentalism is the subject of a worldwide conversation. Then, we can configure nature as both a material and immaterial product that flows between nations.
In 1989, anthropologist Ulf Hanners described the world as a global ecumene, where cultures are shaped through ongoing interactions rather than developing in isolation. This involves the flow of knowledges and ideas, like environmentalism, as well as the exchange of material products, which we observe in the gardens through its imports of flora from all over the world.
Therefore, under this lens, the Gardens by the Bay seems to magnify environmentalism by concentrating expertise, technology, and countless plant species from global sources. As Hanners explains, these global flows are not even. Some places generate knowledge and frameworks, while others adapt them.
Now, where does Gardens by the Bay place Singapore in terms of environmentalism? Is it a source? Is it a sink of global flows? Or is it something else entirely?
In my view, something like expertise is exchanged rather readily and evenly as horticulturists from the gardens speak with others in their field all over the world. And clearly, while Singapore seems to be a sink for plant species as it creates the garden's diverse environments, there is still some level of exchange as Singapore's horticulturists also bring over species native to Singapore when scouting for plants overseas. This was all documented by a 2023 CNA documentary, following horticulturists from Gardens by the Bay as they flew to Latin America in search of new plant species to bring home. As for technology, Singapore clearly prides itself on being a global leader for environmental engineering. So in that sense, it is a center for technological innovation influencing global peripheries. Singapore therefore has a very cosmopolitan relationship with environmentalism. But there is a deeper why here, and it has to do with our history. And it lets us better understand ecological engineering at a global and historical scale. Michel Rolf Trujillo emphasized in his 2003 book Global Transformations that globalization is not new, that global flows or global interconnectedness have existed at the latest by the 16th century, with cross-Atlantic movements like colonialism, slavery, trade, and migration forming a global system. These massive flows shaped the modern world, transforming economies and reshaping cultures.
Singapore, a former British colony, was far from exempt. Rubber plantations were the craze in Southeast Asian colonies as the British flattened and simplified natural ecosystems to harvest a single plant, known as monocropping. Rubber was a cash crop, and the species, most notably Hevea brasiliensis, was transplanted across seas to maximize industrial gain and profit.
Singapore is slowly bouncing back from the environmental destruction wrought by colonization. But in some twisted way, we see the continuation of historical environmental engineering for global exchange and profit. It is just reframed with different values like ecosystem health, sustainability, and conservation. Now, where did Singapore adopt these early environmentalist values?
Was the British again. So, according to Barnard and Hing, the value of maintaining greenery in Singapore stemmed from the British understanding of nature and gardens. Ebenezer Howard, who worked in the English Parliament at the turn of the 20th century, wrote about greenery offering a refuge from congested and unsanitary urban sprawl. Barnard and Hing posit that Howard's conceptions of green spaces within cities were brought over to Singapore through colonial officials. Then, Lewis Mumford wrote in his influential 1961 work that problems in society would only become sustainable with a balance with nature in the creation of an organic city. This, according to Barnard and Hing, would spark Lee Kuan Yew's eventual tree planting campaigns.
It really does seem that Singapore inherited its focus on greenery from flows of Western productions of knowledge and colonial engineering. But can we truly say that the Gardens by the Bay is just some kind of colonial predestination? To that, I say no. Singapore has adapted and reframed its nature and environmentalist ideals according to its own developing agendas. To understand how environmentalism takes shape in Singapore today, we have to look at the role of the state. Chua Beng-huat, in his chapter Singaporeans Ingesting McDonald's, focuses on the globalization of capitalism, tackling this view that nation-states, in their need to open themselves up to global flows of capital just so they can survive, they develop this anxiety of cultural homogenization or dilution. But Chua pushes back on this. He argues that the state plays an active role in shaping the nation's ideological terrain, which then shapes the cultural reception to global capital. So in his analysis, something like McDonald's enters Singapore as a force of Western capital and fast food slop culture, but it is adopted and integrated well into Singapore's cultural fabric due to an existing familiarity with the rationalization of daily life.
Every Singaporean by the 90s is conditioned with the drive for economic success. Queuing is a familiar practice and a function of daily order at bus stops, stores, and supermarkets. Fast food as a gastronomic experience was not even new for Singaporeans who grew up with hawker food. McDonald's is therefore culturally configured not as consumption of the West, per se, in the exoticized sense, but merely the consumption of their food as it inserts itself into the local palate.
The larger idea here is that global products are reinterpreted within local frameworks, which have been shaped by existing state priorities and shared cultural experiences. Environmentalism in Singapore, therefore, while it has its roots in colonial history, has had its ideas filtered through Singapore's local prerogatives, as it deals with a highly urbanized environment constrained by limited land, while prioritizing long-term planning and economic success. Our dear Lee Kuan Yew has been quoted in regards to Changi Airport's greenery.
When they come into the airport, especially investors, they will pass by greenery, which means maintenance. So without having to tell anything to the CEO, I knew that he would understand that when I say we will deliver, he knows that we can deliver.
These words by the late Prime Minister help us tie everything back together. The environment, nature is engineered, curated, and manicured to signal Singapore's technological and economic competency. And that, perhaps, is the underlying reason why Gardens by the Bay, presented as an environmentalist's dream, can still feel artificial. Environmentalism is deeply linked to governance, control, and state messaging.
Let us return to the original question of the kind of environmentalism that the Gardens by the Bay produces. It becomes less useful to judge it against the idea of pure or untouched nature. Instead, what we can now imagine is an environmentalism that is assembled through global flows, shaped by colonial histories of ecological movement and engineering, and actively reworked by the state to fit Singapore's economic and spatial constraints. The gardens draws in plants and expertise from across the world, but it does not simply reproduce them. It reorganizes them into something highly controlled and highly visible, and yet greatly purposeful. In this sense, Singapore is neither a passive sink for environmentalism nor a technocratic source for it. It is a site where environmentalism is translated into a form that is at once ecological, technological, and economic. What Gardens by the Bay reveals, then, is not the failure of environmentalism, but its evolution under the conditions of a global capitalist city.
So, I have a few tidbits of reflection, especially as a life sciences student myself. I have noticed in my education that there are a lot of modern urbanized civilizations that are built on this separation of man and the environment. We are the managers, the controllers, the exploiters, the healers, and protectors. We are taught that humans are not the same as nature, and yet I feel that there are growing conversations and a shared effort to at least rediscover where we stand within nature, rather than outside it. And in the face of climate change and an increasingly exploited planet, humanity is forced to confront its own history of destruction and extraction, which have distanced us from the natural world. What I find hopeful is that there are people from all around the world who care deeply from a bottom up agency perspective. We're all actively working towards repairing our relationship with the environment. So, while Singapore's environmentalism can appear highly engineered and shaped by state priorities or economic goals, I don't think it is entirely empty of meaning or heart. Rather, it reflects an ongoing process, our attempts to reconcile urban life with ecological responsibility. And perhaps that tension between control and care is not a flaw, but a sign that we are still learning how to live with nature in a world that we have already transformed. Or as Rocky would say, fist by bump.